Thank you. Thank you very much. Glenn, you set me up perfectly, as also Murray Hitzman did yesterday. It's wonderful to be here. And I view this as a very safe space, actually. So it's kind of nice to have a trial run of talking about some things that don't get talked about a lot in my business, which is in the mining, exploration, and geoscience science end of the business. So as the incoming president of Society of Economic Geologists, we're thinking a lot about our global geoscientists, where we are, where we're working. 60, 70% of our members are industry, and we work a lot around training those new geoscientists to be part of this whole energy transition, finding the minerals and metals that are so vital. So we're going to talk about this concept of parachute science, which is quite big in health sciences and biosciences, much less talked about in geoscience. But we know that we are part of uh, a sorry, advance my slide here. I'm having the same problems that Stephen had. Um, Hang on. Let's just do it that way. Okay. So first of all, I am in Vancouver. I am on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and feel very privileged to be there. And in fact, I'm also privileged to own a property which has several middens on it. I don't own it, I steward it, and we always have to center ourselves here in BC on those thoughts about the people who were here and are here with us. So looking at this concept of parachute science and the lovely Satarla board that's we're going to turn into a game, where do we where is this conversation centered? Well, we're right down here in the very start. We're at that beginning of the game where we're learning about the geology, we're learning about the rocks, the hazards, the environment, everything that goes into understanding our Earth, and which all the rest of this whole big picture is built on. So how do we define parachute science? It's basically conducting research in a region or a country without developing those relationships that Glenn was just talking about, because it's those relationships that's critical. So local researchers and also local communities are involved in science and research. And so these are the very first, I always talk about exploration geologists as being the first boots on the ground, the first people who interact with the community. But in actual fact, many times it might actually be people from universities, people who are doing research that are there first. And those people also include students, and the relationships that are built at that point are important. And then if people are involved, then the next part is who publishes it, who gets the credit for it, and often those people who are locally based are excluded from significance in publications. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Now my arrow started working. We got to go back. So here's a selection of a whole lot of headlines that have, interestingly enough, in geoscience, popped out in 2021. So why is that? We can imagine all these frustrated geologists sitting at home on their computers and going, what am I going to think about while I can't get out and see the rocks? So I think there was a little bit of flurry of activity kind of looking at in geoscience in general, how our colonial history, our approaches, thinking about decolonizing earth science education, people looking in paleontology at where all the samples were. A whole lot of interesting things were looked at. And as far as I can tell, the rate of publications has also now dropped off because it's, yeah, we're out of COVID and we're back on the rocks. So one of the analyses, and I'm a data person, so I talk to scientists, so we have to have some kind of data to show. And so this article came out actually in 2020, looking at papers published in what we call high impact journals. And if you look out on the right, this map of Africa, and basically the darker colors are where more of the papers have come from, and the lighter colors are fewer. And you can see within Africa also a imbalance in which countries have publications. But on the left, what's interesting is there's this line, there's my laser pointer. There's a line here on the left going straight up the left. That's the percentage of African authors on these papers. The line that kind of starts to build slowly to the right as we get to 2017. So we're starting in 1973, we're going to 2017, get more and more papers and really no more African authors of those papers. And so that is an interesting thing. But as a proportion, we did best back in like 1979 to 1982. There was a much higher proportion of African authors, and generally there's been less and less over time. So there were only 30% out of 183,000 articles, only 30% of the African related papers were by African authors. So this is only really the only way we can really get at what's going on. Same thing in analytical geosciences. We have something called a parachute index, where on the left, the positive numbers are the higher number of domestically based authors. And of course, if you look at United States and China, and actually also Australia, Canada, New Zealand are in that mix, there's more of domestic based authors. When you start to look at Asia, the Caribbean, Oceania, Africa, you start to see these very big negative numbers and many fewer local people. So here is another way of looking at it. So first author affiliation. So you look at the United States on the left, and the orange is domestic, and the authors, there's domestic authors working on domestic rocks. The next category is they're working from somewhere else with no local collaborators, and the blue-green is where they're working somewhere else, but they actually have local involvement. And so we see the same sorts of trends. And we see all these ones in orange would be, they're doing parachute science. They're basically going somewhere, they're working, and they're not working with the local researchers. And in paleontology is one example. So I don't have examples of where all the ore mineral rocks are in the world, but we know that our forebears were tromping around the globe, collecting samples, studying ore deposits, and then squirreling those rocks away in museums. And in Canada, at the Royal Ontario Museum, we have fantastic collections, and they get studied. They're used by researchers. And so obviously those rocks that have come from wherever they have in the world are not necessarily involving the researchers who are now in those places. In the case of Brazil, if you look at this big orange part of the pie here, so this is from a certain location in Brazil, where are all the paleontological samples from that fossils, the fossils from those one particular place in Brazil. Well, that orange section they're all in Germany. So that tells you something. And of course, that's with Brazil having regulations, having permits, not allowing export. They still get squirreled away and exported out of the country, and people work on them. The sample on the right was described by some German authors. It's actually not how they described it. It's not the thing they thought it was. And they didn't work with anybody in Brazil to figure that out. And it's a fundamental come on, you might. So how do we change this paradigm? So we have the parachute, guy comes in, drops in, gets his rocks and leaves. Or can we all play the parachute game? So we look at the process of how we do our research. And right up at the top, we're going to have an ask, we're going to do a concept. And what is the first thing that we need to be doing? We need to be asking the questions about who works there. It's the same questions we ask in exploration industry. Who works there? Who lives there? What permits do we need? What impact will we have? We think that when we walk on the ground that we really have no impact. But there are local people who are probably guiding us, who are probably taking us to the outcrop. And there are local researchers as well. So that's the first part, obvious. It seems obvious. All this stuff is really about human relationships and being a good person. So then the next part is, where do we get the funding? So here's a leverage point where obviously research funds and government grants can actually mandate local collaboration. They can mandate this kind of work with your partners. Industry can also have quite a lot of impact here. We often in industry bring in the high flyer scientists. We bring in the big guy to give us a short course to tell us all about the rocks. Well, does that person interact with any of the local community? Do they do any training? Do they do any workshops? How does that work? Or are we even ignoring the local expert? So industry has a big impact in that situation. And then, of course, lastly, it's on the execution and working to get the best out of our teams, all the things that we talk about everywhere else, and also communicating back to the local people in the community. What did you learn? What did you learn about my rocks? What did you find out? I want to know about that. I mean, I took you to that hill over there that's red. What did you find out? What does that mean? So it's fundamental stuff, but I have to say in the scientific world, it doesn't actually get talked about all that much. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to create better, high quality geological data sets. We're making sure that we talk to the people on the ground who know their rocks and get to the right places. We're talking about getting a transfer of knowledge and skill and research infrastructure development globally that isn't just based in North America or Europe. We're looking at capacity building of the workforce, which means the training of people. And we're hopefully looking at less biased, I'm not going to say unbiased research, but less biased, because as Glenn said, we all have this circle around us and we don't often work collaboratively in the right ways, and we don't always, address the spaces. And ultimately, this may seem like a big thing, a big statement, but I still feel passionately that it's about the well-being of humankind and how do we get to that abundance that we talked about yesterday. This is not a zero-sum game. How do we get to the abundance? So there is actually a code out there. You showed the slide earlier, Glenn, of all those codes. There's actually a research code, and I didn't know about it till I started thinking about this topic, but it is called the Trust Code, and it actually is adopted by the EU and the Commonwealth universities and a whole bunch of organizations. And it's only 4 pages long. It goes through everything pretty much that I've said about what one should do. But fundamentally, the framework are these 4 values: fairness, respect, care, and honesty. And, it's about being a good human, and it's about creating relationships and taking the time to create those relationships where you may or may not think that it's worthwhile, but that you actually take the time to go and find people and work with them. So this is Hallelujah Kanjo. I work on and off with her. She's a PhD researcher at ICRAG in Dublin. She is an example of someone who is now doing a PhD in Dublin. She's from Namibia. She was on my podcast, Discovery to Recovery, which I encourage you all to check out. And her quote, can we do better? Of course we can do better. But she was found, Murray Hitzman talked to her in 2014. And after a few years, eventually she was, brought to Dublin and doing her research. But says she's an example of this is not parachute science where she was valued. But what we want to do is the step further. It's the actual, instead of just bringing people to our institutions, we want to be building those institutions to be better globally. And in the interest of all this, I invite you all to Namibia in September, where the Society of Economic Geologists in Windhoek will be having our annual conference, and we have an accessibility fund. We are working very hard to make sure that it's accessible to people who live locally, and hopefully these conversations will be able to continue. Thank you.
And absolutely brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Anne, for coming and joining us. And to be honest, explaining what this term parachute science actually means. I think all of us were thinking, what on earth is Anne going to be speaking about? So just very quickly, Anne, a question with regards to the conference that's taking place later on this year. So remember, everybody, that's the Society for Economic Geologists conference taking place in Windhoek, starting on the 27th of September this year. In terms of using that almost as the opportunity for this broader development, you said that there was an accessibility fund. Is there anything else that's going on to really try and leverage this opportunity where we've got really one of the world's most well-known economic geology associations having the conference in Africa. Is there anything else that's happening?
What do you mean in terms of bringing people together, like before or after the conference or those sorts of things? In a short, no, not that I'm aware of. We're collaborating with some geophysicists who are meeting like right after us. There's no social we dip our toes into the social part of our science, and we're moving more to think about those things. I wanted originally to have, a session or a workshop around artisanal mining to bring geoscientists into that whole small scale mining, artisanal mining space. And to be honest with you, this conference only is way it's not over our heads, but we started quite late in planning it. So that's unfortunate that that's not going to happen. But what I hope is it's the catalyst for more. And what I hope is that it actually brings, there will be a lot of I mean, I'm hearing about busloads of students coming from various universities, particularly in the southern part of the African continent. And I think there'll be a lot of opportunities for conversations through that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that term being a catalyst, and that's the important bit, isn't it? Because actually, by doing this, then the ripple effect that can come from that could be really, really
In
exciting.
relationships, get as just it's all good. Glenn said it all, right? I don't even need to talk about this because it's all about those people meeting each other and then co-designing a project and then actually valuing each other. And really, the whole thing, this whole problem that we're talking about, responsible raw materials, is just about being good humans.
So on that note, everybody, you've been told by Anne, be a good human, and that will make the world a better place. So awesome. Thank you so, so much, Anne. Really appreciate you coming along today.
Yeah,
Everybody,
thank you.
Anne Thompson. Fantastic. Thank you very much.